In the interest of time, let's jump right in and start with your issues that you identify in your book with democracy, and I guess it's fair to say especially maybe the American kind of democracy. So what are you're mentioning four main issues with democracy, and I would love for you to start us off by just running us through the issues that you see with democracy as a model.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to share my ideas with you and other audience. Right, so I studied and then taught in the US, and then I went back for a year. So totally, I was in the US for 14 years. And I love that country, but I also see the problems. But what I'm going to say is not necessarily based on my American experience. Rather, I think there are four theoretical problems with liberal democracy as a domestic governance model. Okay, so here are the four problems. First, I think the idea of democracy, one person, one vote. By democracy, I mean one person, one vote. So, I mean in terms of the whole package, liberal democracy, I don't have too much problem with the liberal part. I have the problem with the democratic part, the one person, one vote part. And so, what are the problems? So first of all, one person, one vote, oftentimes has the assumption that we the people can understand politics the best. And by implication, it often means that we don't trust politicians, we don't trust the elites. I think that's very bad for the healthy ethos of democracy. So I think that's a minor problem. But more importantly, one person, one vote only gives power to the present living voters. But a lot of issues have something to do with non-voters, either future generations or foreigners, like environmental issues, like federal deficit. But non-voters don't have a say in the democratic mechanism. So that's the second problem. The third problem, among present living voters, the powerful ones tend to silence the powerless ones. So in the recent democratized countries, oftentimes ethnic cleansing happens as a result of the majority suppressing the minority. So in a liberal democratic state, of course that wouldn't happen because of the protection of rights and rule of law and things like that. But still, minorities tend to be ignored by the majority in a non-violent manner. And finally, even among voters who can speak, whose voice can be heard, the assumption that every voter is rational with regard to his or her short-term material interests. So that's a basic assumption. If everyone votes on his or her short-term material interests, put together, we have a collective good, right? But I think that idea has been challenged. The idea that we are rational political animals, that has been challenged. If that doesn't hold up, then the whole mechanism of one person vote becomes deeply problematic. So these are my challenges, in a very short summary.
Excellent, thank you so much. I think there's already a lot to unpack in there. Let me, before we deepen the conversation on this, go back to something you said. So you make a distinction, which I think is an important one, between democracy and liberal democracy. And you already mentioned that your issue is more with the democracy part and not with the liberal part. So tell us briefly, just for sort of clarification and definition issues, what does the liberal part of liberal democracy constitute? So what are these elements that you tend to find not so problematic, contrary to the one person, one vote aspect of democracy?
Right. So in terms of liberal part, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the openness of information available to the people, and the rule of law. I think these are the liberal part of liberal democracy. And in the introduction of my book, Against Liberal Democracy, I argue that I think, first of all, we need to see there are two parts. And second of all, I think more and more we see these two parts are in conflict with each other. We see in the West, especially in the US, the rise of populist right-wing leaders like Donald Trump, who are trying to suppress the free press, try to violate the rule of law. And so in a way, in terms of my domestic proposal, very simply put, I'm trying to save the liberal part from the threat of the democratic part. So that's how I make the distinction.
Before we get to the solutions to the problems you've identified, let me challenge you a bit on the problem itself. So you make a very convincing case that the 4 problems you mentioned, mistrust of elites, one person on vote only, actually giving a voice to currently living people, and so forth. These are issues, but that's probably an argument you hear a lot. There's this famous quote from that's attributed to Churchill, and it's in your book as well. They say, yes, democracy have issues, but all the other forms of government out there that are non-democracy have issues as well. And so basically, at the very least, democracy is just the kind of the one with the least and least troubling problems. How would you respond to that? So wouldn't it be unrealistic to expect a form of government that doesn't have any flaws?
Yeah, I appreciate Churchill's argument. And so in a way, I'm a conservative in that sense. I don't think that we could have a perfect regime that doesn't have any flaws. So I think that so in my book, I'm not trying to defend, say, authoritarianism. I don't think it's a better alternative to liberal democracy. But to say that democracy is the least bad regime, I think that's just the intellectual laziness. Have we ever considered alternatives? Seriously consider alternatives? We do talk about authoritarianism, then we just shrug them off, and then we say, okay, democracy is problematic, but all these other things are bad. But have we really given adequate consideration of all the other possibilities? So in my book, I try to offer such a theoretical alternative that is partly inspired by certain Confucian ideas.
Mm. So the issues that you identify with democracy, they're not new, and other thinkers who have thought about democracy have identified some of them as well, and they have proposed sort of solutions that are broadly within sort of the democratic framework. And you discuss these solutions in your book, and you end up dismissing them as not ultimately working. So talk to us a little bit about the solutions that have been proposed within the democratic framework to the issues that you see, and why you think they're not working.
Yeah, so about the ethos, right? We should have a healthy respect for proper authority, things like that. We could achieve that through some kind of civic education. I think in that sense, the Western Europeans, are doing it better than the Americans, who have a very strong anti-establishment, anti-elitist attitude. So I think we could have a a solution within the liberal democratic framework, but I think a lot of mainstream Western liberal democratic thinkers also see a lot of problems I've mentioned, but they want to make sure voters. So they also think that if voters are not informed, then if we just go through 1% vote, that's not a good democracy. So we need to get voters informed and help them to make at least informed, rational decision, or even better, morally and rationally informed decisions. But I argue that those solutions can never work because today's democracy, most of contemporary states are way too large for common people to have a rational grasp of state matters, and moreover, we're busy. We all, not all, but most of us have to work for a living. So in my book, I mentioned, look at the first democracy in human history, Athens. Athenian democracy. I think there are 2 conditions we often ignore. One, it's a very small state. 20,000 citizens, 200,000 people. So a very small state. And also, the daily chores are often given to the slaves. So it's a democracy built on slaves. And I think slavery is not accidental to Athenian democracy. Slavery freed the Athenian citizens from daily chores so that they could devote themselves to politics. Those two conditions are missing in almost all contemporary states. And so that's why I think all the internal tinkerings of democracy couldn't work. We need to have something more drastic to address the lack of informedness and lack of moral considerations of average voters.
This is an interesting point that you're making, is that there's a size argument, right? So democracy in sort of its purest form does work if the group is small enough so that everybody participating in the process can be informed. Is there, and I'm asking this, sitting here in Switzerland, which is both a democracy and a small country, so where's the cutoff size? What's the largest possible extent where democracy still works, and where does it stop working? Can we quantify this?
Yeah, so I'm a political philosopher. I think it's up to empirical researchers to find the proper size. But to me, any state with more than 1 million people, that's way too large for people to do. And so in that sense, my argument is not really Confucian. Rather, people like Aristotle, Montesquieu, the French philosopher. Montesquieu famously claimed that a democracy only works in a small state, and for a middle-sized state, only monarchy works. For large-sized states, like France, Germany, China, the U.S., for him, only despotism could work. So in my book, I said, really in politics, size matters.
So the book was written and published shortly before the global coronavirus pandemic came. And I was just wondering, do you feel that the response to the pandemic, as we've seen it so far in different countries around the world, does this validate your hypothesis? Is the pandemic one of those issues that democracies are just ill-equipped to deal with? Yeah,
so I think, again, I wouldn't say validate, but at least corroborate with my concerns. So of course, we first thought that Western countries could handle it better, but it turns out that many Western countries, Italy, Spain, and then the U.S. Failed to address this issue properly. But we need to again make a distinction. I think the liberal part again I think shows why it's the good part of liberal democracy, right? At least there is the freedom press. People in the newspaper can criticize Trump and other leaders, which wouldn't happen in a non-liberal state. I wouldn't name any state to protect my own security. So I think that's very important. And that captain of the American aircraft carrier, he was fired for political reasons. But still, this can be discussed openly, and there's a procedure for him to appeal. I think these are the good things about liberal democracy. But those things by themselves don't necessarily lead to good policy making. And good policy making depends upon the policy making part. But if that part is beholden to voters who are not necessarily informed, then we are susceptible to bad policy making. So I think we should try to preserve the liberal part, so that we can at least, even if I die, at least I can die with my voice heard, right? Slightly happier. But to prevent my death, right? To prevent this the spread of the disease, we need to have effective governance, which is not offered by the liberal part of liberal democracy, rather by the policy making part. And democracy, I think, is fundamentally flawed in that part.
Yeah. In the book, and you mentioned this before as well, you also you don't just criticize democracy, you also reject authoritarianism as a solution, and instead you propose what you call a hybrid model, where you sort of add to what is essentially a liberal democracy, you add certain elements that you derive from an analysis of Confucian texts. And we're unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go into the texts themselves, which is a shame. They're fascinating. But briefly, tell us what does the hybrid model that you're proposing look like, and in which way is it Confucian?
Yeah, so I think for Confucians, the state exists to serve the people, and it belongs to the people. So if we use the American President Lincoln's phrase, the democracy is of the people, for the people, and by the people, I think Confucians would embrace the idea that the state exists, and the state belongs to the people, of the people, and for the people. But Confucians also are suspicious of people's capacities of making good decisions, even for themselves. So in that sense, we need to have more competent and morally superior people to make better political decisions. But whether the decisions are good or bad, whether people are happy or not with the policies, that has to be decided by the people themselves. So we could have a democratic element where people's voice can be heard to express whether they're happy with the government or not. But the policy making part, we should have more. I use the term meritocratic. People with certain merits, we should have more meritocratic voice. And one form of achieving this hybrid, is to use the bicameral structures. So a lot of democracies have two houses of legislature. So if we could, we keep one house democratic elected to represent the voice of the people, but somehow if we can identify the intellectually and morally competent people, and then send them to the upper house, and then we can have the two houses balance each other. Maybe we could have more informed decisions for the state.
So let's stay with this for a little bit. It sounds like a potentially good idea in theory, but the thing, I guess, that the question that most people would raise is, how do you identify the people who are supposed to be the moral leaders and the intellectual leaders, and who makes that decision? So isn't there sort of an inherent problem that these people would kind of have to self-identify, and if voters can fundamentally not be trusted to be rational, how would we be able to select those that are, right? So how do you get over that somewhat fundamental problem of selecting the right people for your meritocratic upper house?
Yeah, I think that is a problem that really troubled Confucians throughout the centuries. How to identify the morally and intellectual competent people. So in my book, I argue that the kind of Confucianism I offered is a kind of legalized version, because there's a school in Chinese history called legalism, and they make that kind of challenge. You need to have institution. You need to have mechanism to identify the competent people, and Confucians are fundamentally inadequate in terms of doing that. So in my book, I try to offer sort of institutionalized version of Confucianism. So with regard to Nico, your question, so I propose three mechanisms to identify these people. First is kind of leveled model. So my argument is really that on the communal level, people can make very good decisions. Only on the higher level, people, because they're busy, they don't understand the complicated matters, so their decisions tend to be bad. So in that case, so for the upper house, say on the provincial level, we ask the legislators on the county level to vote for the upper house on the provincial level, because the legislators on the county level, they are more or less free from their daily chores, and they understand they are more involved in politics, so they can make better political decisions in terms of identify who is good, who is bad. So that's one model. I call it leveled model. The second model is the Confucian ideal exams. But clearly you cannot use exams alone to identify the morally competent people, but we could use it as a sort of threshold. So if you want to become, in the American setting, if you want to become a senator, senators are involved with foreign policies. So you have to pass, say, the foreign service exam, which is an exam in the US to test people who want to become diplomats. So you have to know where Iraq is before you can become a senator who is going to make a decision about whether we should go to war with Iraq. So we could have exams. We could have exams as a sort of a qualification for the upper house. The third way I propose is that, again, I'm more familiar with American politics. So if you're a governor of a state in the US for 2 terms, and you have approval rating of 40%, and then you have no criminal records when you're a governor, then you will be sent to the Senate for a 10-year term, but 1 term only. There's no re-election. So you don't have to think about to cater to the voters. Rather, you just make decisions on your own, and your capacities have been tested through your 2-term service as a governor. So there are ways of doing this. And actually, when I'm thinking about Donald Trump, there's a very simple way to have a qualification for a presidential candidate. Say you need to be a governor of a state for 1 term before you can become a presidential candidate. I think we have all these. We have people like Trump who have no experience whatsoever. Then just we see that how they really mess up things because they have no experience of running even a state, let alone the whole federation of state.
And so there are many more questions I would like to ask to this, and I think there's a lot of challenges that we could sort of pose to this model. But since we're a bit short on time, let me move on to the argument that you make in the second half of the book, where you kind of try to expand this model, not just on a country level, but to the global order, where again, we have a whole set of maybe slightly different issues that we're seeing right now, with the system not working anymore as it's supposed to be. So again, briefly, how does the hybrid model or the Confucian model look like for the global order?
Yeah, so in the domestic case, my idea is to give more voice to the morally and intellectual competent people, right? So I basically project this idea to the global realm, right? So we should, in terms of global order, we should give states that pay attention, that are competent, and also show moral concerns for their own people, and to a lesser extent to other peoples. We should give those states more voice in the sort of international arena. I think the fundamental problem is really this. Globalization. We're in the stage of globalization. Globalization means going beyond states. But in today's world, I think in any future world, states are the ones that have real power. So basically, globalization is led by states, but the process itself is the transcending of states. So I think there's an inner conflict. So there are 2 solutions that are proposed. One is the sort of nation-state model, right? So really, eventually, it's the states that have the final say, and we can defend my state interest at all costs. So I think just like what Trump is doing, America first, that kind of idea. And then the other extreme is let's abolish states eventually, completely. And I think for the Confucians, my state's interest comes first, no problem. But at the same time, I cannot protect my state's interest at all costs, because other human beings from other states are also human beings. And one fundamental feature of human beings is compassion, the care for strangers. So in order for my state to be a human or humane state, we have to take a human responsibility. So another way to put what I'm doing on the global scale is, humane duty should override sovereignty. So the sovereignty of each state should depend upon how much human duty it performs to its own people and to a lesser extent to other people. And then I think eventually I hope that those responsible states could form alliance to play the role, for lack of a better term, play the role of benign world peace. I think that's probably the only hope for us to save us from the global chaos we're facing today.
And I think as hopeful as this sounds, the obvious question here, which we're not going to have time to get into too deeply, but the question here again is like, who gets to decide, which states are more responsible and more moral than others? Let me end with another question though. So we've stayed for this conversation more or less sort of in the realm of philosophy and political philosophy, of theory. But I cannot resist asking you this question to end this first part of the conversation. If you had to pick one country, one present day existing country and its current model of governance, obviously there is no country out there that does exactly what you propose in the book, but is there one, or is there a selection of countries that you think comes closest to what you envision? So where should we look to for a real life inspiration?
Yeah, so not any present state. Rather, I would say the United States at its founding, minus slavery and gender inequality. So when the founding fathers, when they created the U.S. out of blue, if you read the Federalist Papers, they are also concerned with the lack of moral and intellectual capacity of the common people. So they designed the Senate, not directly elected by the people, rather elected indirectly by the state legislators. And president was also elected by the electors, indirectly. So all this mechanism is a buffer between the policy making side and the voice of the people. I think these are good buffers, but unfortunately, there are also very bad things like slavery, like gender inequality. So when they try to correct those problems, they throw out, I think, the good things about the founding regime of the U.S. And then only just a very quick note on the global thing. So how do we get there? So I think maybe we could have competing alliances like the EU. Maybe if China is performing its duty, we have a sort of alliance. We have maybe another alliance, US, Canada, and Mexico. So we have all these competing alliances trying to perform global duties like distributing vaccines, coronavirus, and see who is doing a better job, and then let other states decide on which alliance they want to join. So that's my realistic design, but I don't see any states, both domestically and internationally, come closer to what I'm trying to propose.
All right, we're at the end of this first part of the conversation. Professor Bai, thank you so much for coming on today and at this hour to talk to us. The next episode of The End and the Beginning is taking place next week on Thursday, July the 30th, with Maha Aziz, a New York-based political scientist who will argue, somewhat contrary to what Professor Bai has said today, for the end of governments and the rise of activist billionaires. So this should be interesting. Thank you very much. And I'll see you in the Q&A or next week in our next episode.